Hey everybody, ready for a fun one today? We're diving deep into the age-old debate. City life versus country living.
Ah, yeah, the classic.
It's a question I think we've all pondered at some point, right? Like when you're stuck in rush hour traffic
Oh, totally.
and you start daydreaming about wide open spaces.
Or, maybe you're out in the middle of nowhere and you're like, man, I could really go for a decent pizza right now.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to be checking out this YouTube video, and it's called, Is It Better to Live in the City or Countryside?
Oh, cool.
Now it's actually meant for people learning English, but honestly,
Right.
the conversation is so relatable. It's between these two friends, Sarah and Tom, and they bring up some really interesting points about both sides.
I like that. A real conversation gives you a feel for those genuine opinions.
Definitely. So let's start with Sarah. She's our city girl through and through. Right away, she's all about that energy, the constant buzz,
Like so.
like always something to do, tons of options for entertainment. Oh yeah, I can see that appeal, that diversity of experience.
Right. She specifically mentions theaters, and that's something you don't often find out in the country.
True. Cities tend to be hubs for arts and culture. But, there's research showing all that stimulation, while it's exciting for some, it can also be a source of stress for others. Kind of a double-edged sword.
That's a really good point. Okay, so then we have Tom,
No.
and he is all about the peace and quiet, the fresh air.
Ah, the classic nature lover.
He talks about those beautiful landscapes you just don't get in a city, and those long walks in nature, which actually studies have shown that could be super beneficial for your health.
Oh, for sure. Lowers blood pressure, boosts creativity. We're wired to connect with nature, it seems.
Definitely. And that's something Sarah kind of pushes back on a little. She's like, but what about convenience? In the city, everything's right there.
Yeah.
Groceries, restaurants.
Right, right. You
Yeah.
don't have to drive miles for every little thing. Yeah. But then Tom counters with this idea of community. Like, he knows all his neighbors by name, which is pretty rare in a big city these days.
Interesting. So it becomes this question of what do you value more? That convenience or a stronger sense of community? And that can be so different depending on your culture, your upbringing.
Yeah.
There's no one right answer, is there?
It's almost like Sarah and Tom represent these two sides we all have.
Totally, yeah. That pull toward the excitement of the city, but also that longing for peace and quiet.
Exactly. But then they kind of threw this curveball. Remember their solution? Weekends in the country, weekdays in the city.
Oh, yeah. That sounds nice in theory, but, I mean, is that even realistic for most people?
Right. I feel like you'd end up spending your whole life just packing and unpacking.
Totally. And wouldn't that defeat the purpose? Like, if you're constantly going back and forth between these two totally different paces of life.
When do you actually get to relax and enjoy either one?
Right. There's a ton of research on something called place attachment, like the emotional bonds we form with places.
Oh, interesting.
And I wonder if this constant back and forth would actually make it harder to feel that sense of belonging anywhere.
That's a good point. Like, you're never really putting down roots.
Exactly.
But it does make you think, though, right? What if there was a way to have the best of both worlds? Like a place that actually had it all?
Ah, now you're talking. It's funny because urban planners and architects have been trying to figure that out forever. How do you design a space that has the vibrancy of a city?
But also that connection to nature.
Exactly. And that sense of community that Tom was talking about.
I've heard of those co-living spaces popping up in some cities where people share resources, kind of like a modern-day village.
Oh, yeah. And then there are eco-villages, which are more rural, but they're super focused on community and sustainability.
So it seems like people are trying to create these alternatives.
They are. But even those come with their own challenges, right?
Like, how do you keep that close-knit feeling as things grow?
Right. And how do you make them accessible to everyone, not just people with a certain income level?
It always comes back to trade-offs, doesn't it?
It does. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not about finding the perfect solution.
But more about being aware of what's important to you and what you're willing to give up.
Exactly. And that reminds me of something we touched on earlier, how culture influences all of this.
Oh, for sure.
Like in some European cities, they have this amazing mix of old and new, people living in apartments above these bustling markets and cafes.
I love that.
It's just a totally different rhythm of life.
Which I guess all comes back to this idea that there is no one right answer, right?
Exactly. It's about finding what feels right for you, what fits your idea of a good life.
And you know what? I think it's okay for that idea to change as we get older, too. What we want in our 20s might be totally different from what we want in our 50s.
Oh, absolutely. The important thing is to stay open, keep exploring, You never know what you might discover.
So before we move on, I'd love to hear from you, the listener. Think about those co-living spaces, eco-villages, even those European cities we were just talking about. If you could design the perfect place, what would it look like? What would be your must-haves?
All right, we're back for the final part of our city versus country deep dive. It's been pretty thought-provoking so far, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it really has. And I think what stood out to me is how this one simple question, you, city or country, it opens up so many different avenues. We're not just talking about location, we're talking about our values, our lifestyle,
Yeah.
even our personalities.
Right. Like I was thinking about that whole idea of the creative class, how some cities attract people who are drawn to innovation and collaboration. It makes you
Mm.
wonder, does our personality actually influence where we end up living?
Totally. And it connects back to that concept of place attachment. Sometimes it feels like a place chooses us as much as we choose it. It's more than just practicalities. It's like a feeling of belonging. That's interesting. And I know it's not realistic for most people, but even Sarah and Tom's weekend getaway solution, it kind of speaks to that need for multiple outlets, like different spaces for different parts of ourselves.
Yeah, it's like that quote by Wendell Berry. He said, "Nobody can live in the world without being in the country, and nobody can live a full human life without being in a city." Maybe it's not about picking one or the other. Maybe it's about finding ways to weave both those experiences into our lives.
I love that. It reminds me of all those urban gardens popping up in cities. Like people are trying to create these little pockets of nature right in the middle of all the concrete.
Oh, yeah. And on the flip side, you see a lot of rural communities embracing things like co-working spaces and technology. It's like they're bringing a little bit of that urban energy to the countryside.
It's almost like the lines are starting to blur.
I think they are. And maybe that's the key takeaway here. It's not about choosing sides. It's about realizing that both these environments, they offer something valuable. We can find pieces of both in unexpected places if we're open to it.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just the physical spaces too, right?
Right. It's about having a mindset that can appreciate both the excitement of the city.
And the peacefulness of the country.
Exactly. Finding that balance within ourselves, no matter where we choose to live, Yeah. that might be the true best of both worlds.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, we'd like to leave you with one final thought. Instead of asking city or country, what if you asked yourself, what do I need to really thrive? What makes me feel alive? And where can I find that?
Because in the end, it's about creating a life that feels aligned with who you are, no matter where you decide to put down roots. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope you find your own sense of belonging wherever your journey takes you.